You mentioned MIT is being added to Librex. Has it already been added?
Yes, it was added today.
Today. Okay. So let me ask you, this is exciting because I don't know what your thoughts are about this, but I'll tell you from my perspective. If you're, and a lot of MIT folks listen to this, I would love it if you join Librex. It'd be interesting to explore conversations on several topics inside MIT, but one of the most moving that hasn't been discussed at all, except in little flourishes here and there, is the topic of Jeffrey Epstein. Now, there's been a huge amount of impact that the connections of various faculty to Jeffrey Epstein and the various things that have been said had on MIT. But it feels like the difficult conversation haven't been had. It's the administration trying to clean up and give a bunch of BS to try to pretend like, let's just hide this part. Like nothing is broken, nothing to see here. Here's a bad dude that did some bad things and some faculty that kind of misbehaved a little bit because they were a little bit clueless. Let's all look the other way. Harvard did this much better, by the way. They completely... It's almost like people pretend like Harvard didn't have anything to do with Jeffrey Epstein. But I think I'd be curious to hear what those conversations are, because there's conversations on the topic of obviously sort of sexual assault and disrespecting women on any kind of level within academia, but just women in general. That's an important topic to talk about. Many sets of difficult conversations. And the other topic is, funding for research. What are we okay taking money from and what are we not okay taking money from? There's a lot of just interesting, difficult conversations to be had. I've worked with people who, refuse to take money from DoD, Department of Defense, for example, because in some indirect or direct way, you're funding military industrial complex, all those kinds of things. I think with Jeffrey Epstein, it's even more stark, this contrast of what is and isn't ethical to take money from. And I just think, forget academia, I think there's just a lot of interesting, deep human discussions to be had, and they haven't been. And there's been somebody, I don't know if you're familiar with Eric Weinstein, who has been outraged by the fact that nobody's talking about Jeffrey Epstein. Nobody's having these difficult conversations. And Eric himself has had a sort of complicated journey through academia in the sense that he's a really kind of renegade thinker in many kinds of ways. I'm not sure if you know who Eric is by any chance.
Heard the name.
Okay.
I actually checked out Zev.
Zev.
It was heartening for me to see that I was not the youngest person
on this
you're podcast.
The second youngest.
Second youngest.
That's hilarious. But Eric he's kind of a renegade thinker. He's a mathematical physicist with, I believe, a PhD at Harvard, and he spent some time at MIT and so on. But he speaks to the fact that sort of there's a culture of conformity and so on. And if you're somebody who's a bit outside the box, a bit weird in whatever dimension of weird, that makes you actually kind of interesting, that the system kind of wants to make you an outcast, wants to throw you out. And so he kind of opposes that whole idea. So he's the perfect person to have conversations with in this kind of Librex kind of context of anonymity. So yeah, I in that sense, I'll talk to Eric about it too. He probably is unaware of Librex, but I believe he still has a Harvard email and an MIT email. So it'd be fun to kind of see both of us dive in and see what that conversation actually looks like and what people are thinking about it. Because I'll tell you the few conversations I came across, and they were very quickly silenced. And I'm troubled by it. I'm not sure what to think of it. There's a few threads inside MIT, like on a mailing list, discussing Marvin Minsky. I don't know if you know who that is. He's an AI researcher. He's a seminal figure in AI before your time. but one of the most important people in the history of artificial intelligence. And there was a discussion on a thread that involved the interaction between Marvin Minsky and Jeffrey Epstein. That conversation was quickly shut down. One person was pushed out of MIT, Richard Stallman, who's one of the key figures because of that, because he wanted some clarity about the situation. But he also he spoke, like we mentioned earlier, without grace, right? But he was quickly punished by the administration because of a few people protesting. And just that conversation, I guess what bothered me most is it didn't continue. It didn't expand. There was no like complexity and there was a hunger that was clear behind that conversation, especially sort of for me. I'd like to understand. Marvin Minsky was one of the reasons I wanted to come to MIT. He's passed away, but he's one of the key figures in the field that I deeply care about, artificial intelligence. And I thought that his name was dragged through the mud through that situation, and without ever being like resolved. And so it's unclear to me, like, what am I supposed to think about all this? And the only way to come to a conclusion there is to keep talking. It's like the thing we started this conversation with about truth is like, is conversation. So in that sense, I'd love if people on Librex, perhaps in other places, but it seems like Librex is a nice platform to discuss Marvin Minsky, to discuss Jeffrey Epstein, to learn from it, to grow from it, to see how we can make MIT better. As I'm still one of the people, I've always dreamed of being at MIT. It was a dream come true in many ways. And I still believe that MIT is one of the most special places in this world, like many other universities. Universities in general is truly special, man. It hurts my heart when people speak poorly of academia. I understand what they mean. They're very correct, but there is much more, in my opinion, that's beautiful about academia, and that's broken. I mean, I don't know if you have something to comment. It doesn't necessarily need to be about Jeffrey Epstein, but there's these difficult things that come up that test the academic community, right? That it feels like conversation is the only way to resolve it.
I think people have a natural need for closure. And it's not just, I'm not as plugged into what academics are talking about as you would be, Lex, but
kids these days, no respect for Minsky.
Exactly. I mean, especially in the AI community, I'm not necessarily a programmer. But what I will say is that people come to Librex and we always see a huge spike in users whenever there's like a tragedy on campus or something where people need closure. Recently, there was a suicide just the other day on Yale's campus, and people were just coming to pay respects and to say rest in peace and speak also about what might have led to an environment where people are drawn to these terrible results.
So just having a conversation is important there because it brings closure.
People need the space, especially when no one wants to go out and put their head above, be the longest blade of grass on that one.
Yeah.
Because of the stigma.
Yeah.
People need to be able to speak.
Yeah, that fear really bothers me. The fear that silences people, like where they self-censor, where they self-silence. Well, you've created an amazing place. I'm kind of interested in your struggle and your journey of creating positive incentives, because it's a problem in a very different domain that I'm also interested in. So I love robotics. I love human-robot interaction, and so I believe that most people are good, and we can bring out the best in human nature. Social networks is a very tricky space to do that in. So I'm glad you're taking on the problem, and I'm glad you have the mission that you do. I hope you succeed.